Good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Fund Manager Fridays with 5paisa.com. I'm Deepika Asthana, your host for the evening. A term that is closely related with value investing and equity investing is compounding. From being touted as the seventh wonder of the world to finding its way into almost any literature on wealth creation and value investing, compounding has now become almost ubiquitous. So, today we are going to talk about value investing and, in the words of our guest, the joys of compounding. So, joining us today, we have Mr. Gautam Baid, founder of Stellar Wealth Partners and author of the international bestseller on value investing, The Joys of Compounding. Welcome, Gautam. Thank you so very much for being here today.
Hi, Deepika. Thanks for having me over.
Pleasure, pleasure. So, Gautam, I think one thing that is clear to pretty much everybody who embarks into their equity investing journey is this value investing philosophy, and honestly, it has persisted for almost a century now. So, just wanted your thoughts on what is that factor which has made it so evergreen, which has made it so enduring, and it continues to stay as relevant today as it was many, many decades back.
Sure. So the basic principle of buying
Mhm.
something for less than what it is worth will
Mhm.
never get old, right? So
Sure.
as Phil Fisher had rightly said, the
Mhm.
stock market is filled with individuals who know the price of everything, but the value of
Yeah.
nothing. Price is known to everyone in the market, but
Sure.
value is understood by only a select few. And
Sure.
stock prices randomly fluctuate every day,
Sure.
sometimes wildly on either side, but the underlying business value changes
Mm-hmm.
very slowly.
Sure.
And therein lies the big opportunity for us as
Mm-hmm.
value
Mm-hmm.
investors.
Mm-hmm.
Focus Focusing on what is moving is part of our evolutionary instincts, and this explains
Mm-hmm.
why market participants focus more on the volatile stock prices, which keep bobbing about up and down every day, rather than
Mm-hmm.
on business value, which changes very slowly.
Correct. Yeah.
Capitalizing on others' desire to avoid volatility is what makes value investing work.
Mm-hmm.
And Joel Greenblatt, the master practitioner of special situations, summed it up perfectly when he said, "Value investing works,
Mm-hmm.
but value investing does not work all of the time, and that is why
Okay.
value investing works."
Okay. Okay. That maybe the last bit would be a little confusing. So what do you mean when you say that it doesn't work all of the time? Is this something to do with patience and how you need to keep hold the investments for a longer period of time?
So, like I write in my book,
Mm-hmm.
to make money, we need luck, but to sustain it and preserve it, we need consistency. So
Okay.
there'll be certain periods of time when a particular
Mm-hmm.
investing style is out of favor, and during
Mm-hmm.
such periods the pressure always builds on the fund manager or the money manager to alter his investment philosophy. But an
Mm-hmm.
investment philosophy is not something that is available next door. It is
Correct.
something that is gradually built over a period of many years.
Correct.
So just because your particular strategy is not performing, or as per the market return, or is not matching the benchmark return in a particular year, that does
Mm-hmm.
not mean that your strategy is flawed. It simply
Sure.
means that it is not in favor in that particular year. So
Mm-hmm.
during that particular time period, many people who have a desire for instant gratification, they'll simply dump their stocks out of, just
Correct.
out of sheer impatience, and that
Mm-hmm.
is when value investing gets the big opportunity, because you get to buy shares at very reasonable prices when a particular sector or company is out of
Mm-hmm.
favor. At the
Mm-hmm.
same time, it is very important to differentiate between a value trap, which is a company in permanent decline, the underlying business is declining, versus a high quality business which is
Mm-hmm.
facing a temporary headwind or a temporary roadblock. So that is
Mm-hmm.
how, just by focusing on the underlying business, we value
Mm-hmm.
investors get to outperform, but only over
Mm-hmm.
the very long run. In the short
Mm-hmm.
term, no one knows what's going to happen to any particular stock or the stock market index, but
Sure.
over the long run, you'll do pretty well.
Mm-hmm. So, Gautam, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on this concept of a value trap, right? Because I've also read this and I'm paraphrasing here that sometimes some things are cheap for a reason, right? I think that's where the whole concept of value trap comes in. That even though some stocks might seem cheap, maybe there is a reason. Like you said, there might be some fundamental issues with the stock. So, can we elaborate a little bit more on this?
Yes, so value traps are also known in the investing parlance as crumbling castle.
Okay.
A crumbling castle is a business
Mm-hmm.
which is losing relevance among its
Mm-hmm.
customers. I'll give you a good example here. So even
Sure.
though the stock of Maruti looks very cheap today,
Mm-hmm.
but if they do not make the transition to electric vehicles very soon, they'll miss the bus and they may lose relevance with their customers 10 years down the line. So that's an example of a value trap. Another example is the print media or the newspaper stocks in India.
Sure,
For the last 10 years, they have looked cheap and they will remain cheap because the entire world is going towards digital consumption of media and content. So it's very important to understand the trajectory of the business. Investing is nothing but all about assessing the future, keeping probabilities in mind, right? So just focus on the trajectory of the underlying business. If the trajectory is up, you'll make money. And if the trajectory is in decline, you will end up losing capital. So that is basically investing. Simple, but not easy.
Not easy, yes. And I think especially not easy because, like you said, you determine the trajectory, right? But it might not pan out immediately in the short term, and thus to have that conviction and that patience to uh, maintain your positions once you have your trajectory in place is a little challenging because as human beings we're all emotional, we have our own psychological biases which kind of prevent us from making rational investment decisions. So from that perspective, I mean, I don't think we can take out the emotion from the investment equation. Yet I think there are ways where we can avoid falling prey to such biases. So can you maybe throw some light upon what these biases could be and how you can make better investment decisions?
So I'll illustrate this with the help of a personal example from my investing journey.
Sure.
So in my book, I've talked about my investment in a stock named HEG Limited in 2017, on which I'd made a big profit on a big allocation. It was a life-changing experience for me, and I had sold the stock in early February 2018. One month after the date of my sale, I came across a news report which stated that graphite electrodes, the primary product of HEG, was selling in the spot market at an even higher price per metric ton, and that the supply situation in the industry was becoming even tighter. When the facts change, Deepika, change your mind.
Okay.
I immediately repurchased HEG, this time with half the percentage allocation that I had at the time of my previous exit. And in one single go, I was able to conquer a host of personal biases which had affected me since the beginning of my investing career, namely commitment and consistency bias, anchoring bias, and status quo bias.
Okay.
So I'll just quickly elaborate on these three biases very quickly. Commitment and consistency bias simply means holding on to a publicly stated position even though the facts have changed for the worse. So that's why as many value investors resist talking about their positions publicly, because then it creates public pressure to maintain that consistency, and that okay, I've mentioned this particular stock as a good business. Now it's almost as if you're not allowed to sell it after you recommend it in public or talk highly about it in public. Sure. So a simple way to avoid the consistency and commitment bias is to avoid discussing stocks in social media and in the media in general. Just focus on your research, focus on the facts, because many people can confuse. The idea is not to be consistent. The idea is to be right. So, but many people assume consistency with being right. That's not the case in today's fast-changing world. Like Jeff Bezos has said, if you're not changing your mind very often, then you'll be left behind in today's world. That's what Jeff Bezos has also rightly said. Okay, so that was commitment and consistency bias. The second one is anchoring bias, or simply anchoring onto a particular reference point, meaningless reference point like the cost price. You should immediately forget the cost price or the price you paid for a stock the moment you buy it. Otherwise, it will forever affect your judgment. So because that's a sunk cost, that's a cost incurred in the past, right? And all that matters is the potential for the stock from the current market price. That is all that matters in investing. So everything is a function of opportunity costs. Assess all your holdings on a daily basis in terms of the opportunity cost. If a particular stock is not expected to deliver even a decent return over the next 3-4 years, the time has come to replace that with a better opportunity. Right? That's basically about anchoring bias. And the third one is status quo bias. And this basically is again evolutionary. That is the way human beings are structured. We are just structured to conserve as much mental energy as possible. And that's why we remain stuck on to bad decisions, even though information has changed, circumstances have changed. We still want to just hold on to past mistakes because we don't want to admit that we made a mistake. That's called status quo bias. So this is why the HEG investment will always be very special for me, because it was a big step forward in my evolution towards rationality. I finally sold my second investment in HEG in August 2018 at a good profit, resulting in a total compounded profit of more than 350% in less than 1 year on that particular company stock. And it was only possible because I let facts dictate my decisions, not emotions.
Perfect. So I love the way you've kind of broken these biases and walked us through how they can impact the decision making process. But so I think you will also admit that a lot of these things are easier said than done. So from that perspective, do you think investors can have some sort of checklists or investing process which can help them make higher quality decisions in investing?
Yes, so that it's a checklist is very, very important, and that is why I've
Mm-hmm.
dedicated an entire chapter to the concept of checklist in my book as well.
Mm-hmm.
You see, a prudent investor
Mm-hmm.
never purchases ownership in a company without conducting the necessary due diligence. Study about the company and its competitors, both
Mm-hmm.
listed and unlisted, from company website, information on the internet, and company filings. After that, read the last 10 years of annual reports, proxies, notes and schedules to the financial statements, management
Mm-hmm.
discussion and analysis sections, or
Mm-hmm.
what we call MDA. Within the
Mm-hmm.
MDA, check for changes in the management tone and industry
Mm-hmm.
outlook changes, and also observe the recent trends in insider shareholding. And after
Okay.
you have concluded the initial groundwork,
Mm-hmm.
proceed to study the following parameters in checklist fashion:
Okay.
income statement analysis, balance
Mm-hmm.
sheet analysis, cash flow
Mm-hmm.
analysis, operating efficiency analysis, returns ratios analysis, management quality analysis, and a psychological checklist of the standard causes of human misjudgment. And all
Okay.
these different categories are covered extensively in my book's chapter on checklists. At the same time, it's very important to understand and realize that the ideal checklist is
Mm-hmm.
subjective and it varies from situation to situation. For
Okay.
instance, the primary checklist items you will look at when assessing commodities, cyclicals,
Mm-hmm.
or special situations like demergers and reverse mergers is very different from the primary checklist items you will look at when you're assessing high quality businesses, where the quality of the underlying business and the quality of the management is the most important.
Okay. So are you saying that depending on maybe the sector or maybe the market capitalization, the weights given to different parameters in the checklist should change?
No, so there is a standard checklist. The 7 items I mentioned to you in the
Mm-hmm.
just a while ago. Those 7 checklists and the items within them remain constant. But
Okay.
the primary item or the most important thing to look at,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that depends on the underlying business. Because, like I wrote in my book in the chapter on simplicity as well, that
Mm-hmm.
in every situation of
Mm-hmm.
investing, there are only 2 or 3 key variables that really matter to an investment decision. So
Sure.
90% of the output will be driven by just 10% of the insights which you have as an
Mm-hmm.
investor. So
Sure.
it's very
Okay.
important to have high impact insights. That is what you
Mm-hmm.
should focus on. And this refinement, this sophistication, this ability to curate and just focus on what is really, really important and knowable, this is developed over time and with experience in investing in the market.
Sure, sure. So actually, Gautam, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it also comes back to what you initially started with, that we as humans need to evolve and be aware of what is happening around us in the market and in the industry. So, for example, your checklist serves as a great foundation to select the right stocks. But even then, one needs to understand what are the changes that could, trigger growth or, impact growth in our select stocks and industries. And,
Yes,
we need to be constantly aware of this.
true. Yes, that's obvious, right? Like 10 years ago, we would have never imagined the kind of impact which new industries like social media, cloud computing, digital
Yes,
transformation, electric vehicles would have. But
absolutely. Yeah.
it's all about change. Investing is all about keeping up with the times and adapting with the times.
Interesting. So you have to be an agile investor.
Yes.
It comes to your biases as well about being
Basically,
anchoring.
it's very simple. If I could just summarize this very simply,
Yes, please.
strong conviction, loosely held. That's basically what good investing is all about.
I like that. Strong conviction, loosely held. Fabulous. That sums it up. Perfect. I believe in that. So let's also, I think now that we've discussed a little bit of stock picking, I think a problem which a lot of people face is position sizing, right? Opportunities, even if you identify a lot of opportunities, how much money or capital do you allocate here, right? So there are some finer nuances to individual position sizing. uh, can you maybe, through your experience, help us understand how we can approach this as investors?
So I size individual positions in my portfolio according
Mm-hmm.
to my evaluation of potential risk, with the
Mm-hmm.
largest allocations having the lowest likelihood of permanent loss of capital coupled
Okay.
with above average return potential. I initiate new positions with a minimum weighting of 3 to 5% and
Mm-hmm.
subsequently average upwards if the management executes above my expectation. And it's
Okay.
very important to understand that individual position sizing is important not only for its impact on overall portfolio performance, but also for one's mental peace of mind. I sell down to the sleeping point if any one single position becomes a discomfortingly large percentage of my portfolio value. And one should have higher weights in businesses with healthy growth prospects, disciplined capital allocators, and high longevity and high predictability of growth. As Mae West aptly said, too much of a good thing can be wonderful.
So I need to ask you something here, Gautam, because we talk about diversification all the time, right? And how it's so important to mitigate overall portfolio risk. So in your opinion, how much of a, and I, this might be a little generic, but how much of a position then becomes a concentrated exposure? And so you said you start with about 3 to 5% allocation. Does this have a ceiling as well? Ki isse zyada we're not going to allocate to a position irrespective of how good it might look?
So there is no formal hard cap as such, but prudence is maintained at the overall portfolio level at all times, because I do not want one single company or one single business or one single promoter to dictate my life's outcome. So once a certain position becomes more than 20% of the portfolio by value, I start trimming it down to 15%. Like basically, I just start trimming it down, take some profits home, and deploy that particular proceeds into a better opportunity if possible. Otherwise, I sit in cash. But I just try to limit individual, like on a personal level, I try to limit individual stock exposures to less than 20% by market value.
So this is an interesting approach, Gautam, because we've also heard a little bit about how timing the market is so tough, right? I mean, it's almost impossible. So would you say that this is also a very good way of kind of taking home some of the profits in a timely manner?
Again, it depends on the individual risk appetite. See, after having achieved financial independence through such a lot of hard work over the last 15 years, for me, when I was in my initial years of my investing journey, I used to have even higher allocations, as high as 25% in a single stock.
Okay.
But over time, I've just become, with age and with experience, I've just become much more conservative and much more prudent. Now that I'm advising people, public money, I just would like to structure my firm for long-term success, and the key to compounding in the long term is endurance and survival. Survival is the only road to riches. So over time, I've come to realize that one does not really need to swing for the fences in the stock market. One just needs patience and a long-term time horizon, because the magic of compounding is so powerful. At 20% compounding rate, your initial capital becomes almost 100 times in 25 years.
Right.
I mean, that means that if you invest 10 lakh rupees in the beginning, the 10 lakh becomes 10 crores at the end of 25 years. But out of that 99 crores, almost 65 crores, or 2/3 of the total money is made in the last 5 years, because the power of compounding is backloaded. Right. At the end of year 10, you'll have 6 times your money. At the end of year 20, you'll have 38 times your money. And the balance 62 times will come in the last 5 years. And that is why the stock market is designed in such a way, it will test your tolerance for pain every single year. Your tolerance for pain. And like there's a famous saying that if you don't know who you are, the stock market is a very expensive place to find out. It is because the stock market plays on our biggest weaknesses of greed and fear.
Absolutely.
So all that is required is a long-term mindset and discipline. Those are much, much more important than raw intellect if you want to really succeed over the long term as an investor.
Perfect. And I think, Gautam, you brought out a very interesting point here, because like I started this conversation with how there's so much written about compounding. And I'm sure like many of our viewers have also read a lot of stuff on compounding. But I think this little particular thing that you just pointed out about how compounding being back-ended in nature. So we all know that over the long term, the longer you invest, the better you can reap the benefits of compounding. But I find this particular analysis that you just brought forward about how nearly 62% of the compounding actually happens in the last 10% of the time period. And that is very interesting, because that is when, like you said, the market keeps testing us, and that is when we tend to give up, especially if the market is volatile and we've already made a certain amount of money. So the compulsion to exit is very high at that point of time, and I think that is where one should actually persist in all of these checklists that you've just mentioned, and awareness of the investment environment can be very helpful. So that
I would like to add something here. So in my book, I've shared a particular table in which I show a collection of high quality businesses and bad quality businesses in January 2008, just at the peak of the previous bull market. That in January 2008, the Indian stock market had peaked at 21,000. And from January 2008, at the peak of the bull market, through the end of the subsequent bear market in January 2008 and January 2013, over the 5 years, even when measured from the previous bull market peak to the subsequent bear market bottom, the high quality stocks gave returns of hundreds of percent, like 200, 300% as a basket. But the bad quality businesses fell 85, 90% over the next 5 years. This was the eureka moment for me. I mean, as an investor, I was just mind blown when I came across that table on an online blog. It taught me that high quality businesses with growth eventually, over a long period and across multiple market cycles, eventually create wealth. But even in the middle of negative headlines like rising inflation, rising interest rates, geopolitical tensions, disease outbreaks, whatever comes, they are able to create wealth for the investor on the long term. But bad quality businesses eventually destroy wealth, irrespective of whether the headlines are negative or positive.
Interesting. So quality as a factor is also very important.
Very, very important for preserving wealth, because quality is, many people make paper fortunes in a bull market, but very few people are able to retain that paper fortune after the bull market ends. Basically, in a bull market, it's easy to make big money on paper, but very few people are able to preserve it once the eventual bear market arrives.
Absolutely. And I think that advice is very relevant at the current moment, because I think we've been reading so many headlines, right? That these many retail accounts have opened, demat accounts have opened, and lots of investors are getting into the market. And many of these first-time investors who've gotten in over the last 18 months have only seen an upward moving market, right? Which means that they've not invested through cycles. And what you just said about quality, because right now I think you would also agree, many people feel ki, we are stock market geniuses, we can generate so many returns. But I think over a period of time, the market will teach you that it's not easy. And then advice like what you just said, invest in quality and hold still, would really be valuable for the investors.
Well, mistakes are made in a bull market and the hard lessons are learned in the subsequent bear market. That is basically my experience of the last 15 years. And we get to, as long as you're humble and willing to acknowledge and accept that we made a mistake. And even I've made all those mistakes in the past, in the initial years of my investing career. But I'm grateful to these mistakes because these have been my greatest teachers, right? They have made me a much better investor today compared to where I was 15 years ago. So there is no shortcut. You have to go through the pain in order to enjoy the long-term gain.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I think also you've written in your book that the frequency of correctness does not matter. It is the magnitude of correctness that matters. This struck me is very insightful, but would be great if you could elaborate a little bit here.
Sure. So, Deepika, anyone can identify a winning stock, but the great investors differentiate themselves through superior individual position sizing. Right. Given that the success rate for even the best investors in the world is less than 50%, it really does matter that when you win, you make it count. And the frequency of correctness does not matter. It is the frequency multiplied by the magnitude of the payoff that matters. When you find a truly great stock idea, you should buy enough of it to make a meaningful difference to your life. And this is also known in the investing parlance as the Babe Ruth effect, or this is also what George Soros was referring to when he said that it's not whether you're right or wrong that's important. What matters is how much money you make when you're right and how much money you lose when you're wrong. Investing is not about batting average. It is all about the slugging percentage. So always evaluate yourself at the portfolio level, because some individual stocks going wrong is a routine part of the game. Right. That really shouldn't bother you that much. Only thing that matters is you learn from your mistakes and move on. But always assess yourself at the portfolio level. Portfolio level returns is what matters. It is why in the mutual fund industry, because the mutual fund investors only get quoted the NAV every day. That's actually a composite measure. That's why they're able to stay there for a longer term. Because if they started fixating on the individual stock holdings moving up and down every day, then they would end up making some behavioral biases.
Right. So that's interesting. I don't know if this would be relevant, but I had read somewhere that like venture capital returns, right? They follow non-normal distribution because
Power law. Yep.
yeah, yes, exactly, the power law, exactly. So basically, just one or two bets need to be right, but those need to be the magnitude of that correctness needs to be big, so that it kind of covers up for any other smaller, big or small losses on the other bets. Is this something similar?
So that's basically how I approach macro cap investing in my portfolio. So
Okay.
if I buy 2 or 3 very promising macro caps, then I control the risk through allocation. So I won't allocate more than 2% to a macro cap today in my portfolio. So that, because if a potential small company has got the potential to become 15, 20 times in the next 10 years, that's a risk worth taking, as long as I practice prudent diversification, which I do at the portfolio level. So basically, over the long run, you'll notice, and this holds true for most of the successful investors, that only a handful, probably less than 20% of their total number of stock picks in their career define their entire investing journey. So 20% of the stock selection drives more than 80% of their wealth creation over the very long term. And this is a common phenomenon. This is also called as the Pareto principle, basically what we call it.
Right. Perfect. I think that is, I think through this conversation, there are some themes which have come out or emerged in terms of patience, holding on to your positions, focusing on quality. I've asked you a lot of questions, but I personally feel that all roads are kind of, all answers are leading to these two, three overarching principles in investing. So I think enough food for thought for many of our viewers today. I just want to ask you one last question, because I can see a fabulous bookshelf in the background. You've written a fabulous book, The Joys of Compounding, which I have thoroughly enjoyed reading, and I hope our viewers will also pick up and take a leaf out of that. So other than that, maybe 2 to 3 books from your book collection that you would recommend, which you feel would be a good value addition to any library.
Sure. So I'll name 3 investing books and 3 non-investing books.
Sure.
As far as investing books are concerned, I would like to highlight Investing for Growth by Terry Smith, which taught me how to invest in high quality businesses for the long term.
Okay.
And Capital Returns, edited by Edward Chancellor. That's a great read on the capital cycle. That taught me how to invest in commodities and cyclicals. And Joel Greenblatt's classic, You Can Be a Stock Market Genius, taught me how to invest in various special situations. And for non-investing books, I would highly recommend More Than You Know by Michael Mauboussin.
Okay.
And Seeking Wisdom by Peter Bevelin, and Poor Charlie's Almanac. I think these are 3 great books on multidisciplinary thinking.
Fabulous. Thank you. I don't know if our readers got that, but when we post this, we will also, put up these names, because it's very interesting. Sometimes, even if you can't read the entire book, I think the key takeaways when you go through the book and keep applying it in your investing and personal journeys, the value can be amplified. So thank you very much, Gautam, for being here today, for sharing such fabulous insights. Much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepika.
And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. We will see you next Friday. Until then, have a great weekend. Thank you.